Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Playing with Power MTG, where we play with the most powerful cards in the most powerful formats. Tonight's game is brought to you by TCGplayer.com, where you can find all of your cards online while still supporting local game stores. Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks, and through Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. For tonight's game, we are playing CEDH with one of our patrons, Charles. If you have ever wanted to be on an episode, consider signing up for our Mox Pearl tier on Patreon. You get all kinds of Patreon benefits, and you will get to be in a video with us. With the Playing with Power team playing some of their favorite decks, and Charles playing his signature mono-white strategy, we are ready to kick this game off. So, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Folger piloting his signature deck of Thrasios Triton Hero and Vial Smasher the Fierce. This is a control deck that takes advantage of Thrasios' ability and the synergy between Vial Smasher and Curiosity to generate value while stopping your opponents. Folger's opening hand contains a Wooded Foothills, Marsh Flats, Swamp, Mox Diamond, Arcane Signet, Mystic Remora, and a Phantasmal Image. Next, we have Mike bringing the Boros Beats with Winota, Join Our Forces. Winota is a stacks deck that takes advantage of Winota's ability to break parity with all the stack's pieces in CEDH. With your opponent's stacks out, it then tries to assemble a Kiki Jiki or Splinter Twin combo to win the game. Mike's opening hand contains a Battlefield Forge, Cavern of Souls, Mountain, Wear and Tear, Mog Fanatic, Ranger Captain of Eos, and a Jeweled Lotus. After that, we have Charles bringing the mono-white partner pair of Rebbec, Architect of Ascension, and Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist. This is an equipment and stacks deck that looks to stacks the board in the early game. Then in the mid and late game, it takes advantage of your commander synergies to equip your creatures and protect the equipment to create winning board states. Charles' opening hand contains 3 plains, land tax, Stoneforge Mystic, Hushwing Gryff, and a Sword of Feast and Famine. Finally, we have Zach playing Tatyova, Benthic Druid. This is a landfall synergy deck. This deck seeks to take advantage of the draw power of your commander while ramping heavily and taking advantage of the lands matter synergy. This deck then looks to pull off a combo to close out the game. Zach's opening hand contains a Ramanop Excavator, Pongify, 3 Visits, Elvish Reclaimer, Ponder, Forest, and a Breeding Pool. Without further ado, let's kick off this excellent exceptional exclamation of excitement. Folger wins the Dockside Math Challenge and gets to start us off. Folger draws a card for turn, and then plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Swamp. He sacrifices Wooded Foothills, paying a life, and finds a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Arcane Signet. He follows that up with a turn 1 Mystic Remora. The Remora resolves, and with the table on high alert, he passes to Mike. Mike draws for the turn, and then plays a Battlefield Forge. He taps Battlefield Forge to cast Mog Fanatic. He passes. Charles draws for the turn, and then plays a Plains. He casts Land Tax. Mystic Remora triggers, and Folger draws. Charles ends the turn. Zach draws a card for turn, and then plays a Forest. He casts Elvish Reclaimer. Zach passes to Folger. During his upkeep, Folger pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws, and then plays a Mana Confluence. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He follows that up by tapping Mana Confluence to cast Llanowar Elves. He casts a Chrome Mox. It resolves, and he imprints Phantasmal Image. He passes to Mike. Mike draws, and then plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Folger draws. He taps Battlefield Forge to cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves the combat and swings Mog Fanatic at Charles, triggering Winota. The trigger resolves, and Mike looks at the top 6 and puts an Ethersworn Canoness onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Charles. Charles takes 3 damage, and Mike passes the turn. During his upkeep, Charles' land tax triggers. He fetches 3 plains and then puts them into his hand. He draws, and then plays a plains as his land for turn. He casts Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and he fetches up a Colossus Hammer into his hand. Charles passes the turn, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Remora triggers and Folger pays for it. He draws and then plays a Marsh Flats as his land for turn. He passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Mike draws and then negotiates a deal with Charles not to block his Fanatic. Charles agrees, and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Ethersworn Canoness and Charles with Mog Fanatic. Winota triggers 2 times. Mike looks at the top 6, and then puts a Mog Catcher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Folger. The second trigger resolves, and he fails to find. Folger blocks Ethersworn Canoness with Thrasios. Folger takes 2 damage, and Charles takes 1. In his second main phase, Mike plays a Mountain as his land for turn. Mike then sacrifices Mog Fanatic to deal 1 damage to Thrasios. Folger responds by tapping his Mana Confluence to activate Thrasios. He scries and reveals a Verdant Catacombs, putting it onto the battlefield tapped. Thrasios dies, and then Mike taps Battlefield Forge to cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It resolves, and he fetches up a Hope of Girapur and puts it into his hand. Mike then casts Hope of Ghirapur. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Charles' land tax triggers and he fetches up 3 plains and puts them into his hand. He then draws and plays the plains for turn. He casts a Cursed Totem. Remora triggers and Folger draws. In response, Zach activates Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a forest and fetching up an ancient tomb onto the battlefield. Cursed Totem then resolves, and Charles passes. Zach draws and then casts a Ramanop Excavator. He plays a forest from his graveyard as his land for turn through Ramanop. Zach passes to Folger. At the end of Zach's turn, Folger cracks his Marsh Flats and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. During his upkeep, Folger pays for his Remora. He draws and then plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. He then slams a Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life. Deluge resolves, killing every creature on the battlefield. He passes to Mike. During Mike's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. Mike draws and then plays a Flooded Strand. Mike casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. He follows it up by casting a Remorseful Cleric. Mike passes. During his upkeep, Charles' land tax triggers and he fetches up 3 plains into his hand. Charles draws and then plays the plains as his land for turn. He casts one of his commanders, Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist. Charles then casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Folger draws a card. Charles then passes to Zach, discarding to hand size. Zach draws, takes no actions, and ends his turn. At his end step, Folger cracks his Verdant Catacombs. Mike responds to Folger's fetch by cracking his Flooded Strand. With both fetches on the stack, Zach responds by casting Beast Within, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Folger draws a card. Mystic Remora dies and Folger creates a 3/3 beast. Mike's fetch resolves and he puts a basic plains onto the battlefield. Folger's Verdant Catacombs resolves and he puts an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. Then the turn moves to Folger. Folger draws and plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it and puts a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Folger taps his Mana Confluence to cast his other commander, Vial Smasher the Fierce. Folger then casts Oko, Thief of Crowns. He activates Oko's second ability, turning Charles' commander Ardenn into a 3/3 elk with no abilities. Folger passes to Mike. During Mike's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then recasts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Mike moves to combat and attacks Zach with Thalia and Oko with Remorseful Cleric. Winota triggers. Mike looks at the top 6, pauses, and then checks a magic ruling. Then Mike puts Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Folger. Folger realizes what is happening and cries internally. Zealous Conscript triggers, and Mike steals Oko, Thief of Crowns. Zach takes 2 and Folger takes 3. In his second main phase, Mike activates Oko's third ability, killing Oko, and then exchanging control of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and Vial Smasher the Fierce. Mike then shifts the turn to Charles. During Charles' upkeep, land tax triggers and he fetches up 3 plains into his hand. Also in his upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays the plains for turn. Charles then casts a Sword of Feast and Famine. He equips his elk with the Sword of Feast and Famine. Charles moves to combat and attacks Folger with the elk. Folger doesn't block and takes 5. Sword of Feast and Famine triggers, and with the trigger on the stack, Charles floats 1 mana. The trigger resolves, Folger discards Arid Mesa, and then Charles untaps his lands. Before mana fades, Charles flashes in a Hushwing Gryff. In his second main phase, he casts Colossus Hammer. Charles then passes to Zach. Zach draws and then plays an island as his land for the turn. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Tatyova, Benthic Druid. Zach passes. Folger draws and then casts Ghostly Pilferer. He then recasts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Folger ends his turn. During Mike's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then moves to combat. Mike swings Vial Smasher and Winota at Charles and Remorseful Cleric at Folger. Winota triggers twice, and Mike looks at the top 6, failing to find both times. Both take the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Gamble. Vial Smasher triggers and then deals 1 damage to Folger. Gamble resolves, and Mike fetches a card into his hand. He then discards a card at random, the card he searched for, Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker. With the red Entomb resolves, Mike plays a command tower as his land, and then passes to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Land tax triggers, and he fetches up 3 plains into his hand. Charles draws, and then plays a plains as his land for turn. He then equips Colossus Hammer to his elk. Charles moves to combat, and attacks Folger with Hushwing Gryff and Zach with his elk token. Neither player block, Folger takes 2, and Zach takes 15. Sword of Feast and Famine triggers, Zach discards Counterspell, and then Charles untaps his lands. In his second main phase, Charles casts Drannith Magistrate. Charles then casts his other commander, Rebbec, Architect of Ascension. Ghostly Pilferer triggers, and Folger draws a card. Rebbec resolves, and Charles passes to Zach, discarding to hand size. Zach draws, and then casts 3 visits. He fetches up a snow-covered forest onto the battlefield. Tatyova triggers, Zach draws, and then gains 1 life. Zach plays a tropical island as his land for turn, triggering Tatyova again. He draws and gains another life. Zach casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, doesn't like what he sees, shuffles, and draws. Zach casts Chrome Mox. It resolves and he imprints Eternal Witness. Zach ends his turn. Folger draws and then casts an Arbor Elf. He follows it up by casting Deathrite Shaman. Folger passes the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. Mike draws and then moves to combat. He swings Remorseful Cleric at Folger. Winota triggers, he looks at the top 6, but he fails to find. Folger then takes 2 damage. In his second main phase, Mike casts Eidolon of Rhetoric, triggering Vial Smasher. Vial Smasher resolves, and she continues her vendetta against Folger, hitting him for 3. Mike then passes. During his upkeep, Charles loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Charles draws, and then plays a Plains as his land for turn. He casts Sword of War and Peace. He equips the Sword of War and Peace to his Elk token. Charles moves to combat, and then attacks Zach with his Elk. Zach responds with a perfect answer, Pongify. Pongify resolves, kills the Elk token, and then Charles creates a 3/3 ape. In his second main phase, Charles equips the Sword of War and Peace to his commander, Rebbec. Charles then ends his turn. Zach draws, and then taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Scapeshift. Scapeshift resolves, and then Zach sacrifices 4 lands. Zach fetches up a Misty Rainforest, Prismatic Vista, Wooded Foothills, and a Blast Zone onto the battlefield tapped. Tatyova triggers 4 times. Zach draws 4 cards and then gains 4 life. He plays an island as his land for turn, triggering Tatyova again. Zach gains 1 life and draws a card. Zach passes to Folger. Folger draws and then casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and then loses 2 life. Folger passes. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Mike draws and then moves to combat. He makes a deal with Charles not to block his Vial Smasher. Charles agrees again. Mike swings Eidolon at Zach, Vial Smasher at Charles, and Remorseful Cleric at Folger. Winota triggers 3 times. In response, Folger floats a black mana just in case Mike hits Magus of the Moon. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Sanctum Prelate onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Folger, naming 1 as it enters. Mike looks at the top 6 again and puts Mother of Runes into play, tapped and attacking Folger. He looks at the top 6 again and puts a Village Bellringer into play, tapped and attacking Folger. Village Bellringer triggers and Mike untaps all of his creatures. Folger blocks the indestructible creatures with Thrasios, Deathrite Shaman, and his Beast token. Zach blocks the Eidolon with Tatyova. Folger takes 2, and then Charles takes 2. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Charles loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then equips Sword of War and Peace to Hushwing Grift. In response to the equip, Folger casts the weakest Fire Covenant to ever grace a CEDH table, paying 1 life to kill Hushwing Grift. Charles then recasts his commander, Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist. Ghostly Pilferer triggers and Folger draws a card. In response to Ardenn, Zach casts Force of Will, paying 1 life and exiling a blue card, countering Charles' commander. Charles then equips his 3/3 ape token with Sword of Feast and Famine. He moves to combat and then attacks Zach with the ape token. Zach takes 5, discards Llanowar Scout, and Charles untaps his lands. In his second main phase, Charles equips his commander Rebbec with the Sword of Feast and Famine and the Sword of War and Peace. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and then cracks his Prismatic Vista, fetching up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Tatyova triggers, Zach gains 1 life and draws a card. He cracks his Wooded Foothills and puts a forest onto the battlefield. Tatyova triggers again, Zach gains 1 life and draws another card. Zach cracks his Misty Rainforest and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Tatyova triggers, he gains a life and draws a card. Zach plays a Simic Growth Chamber as his land for the turn. Tatyova and the land both trigger. Zach gains a life, draws a card, and then returns the Simic Growth Chamber to his hand. He casts Azusa, Lost But Seeking. Zach plays his second land for the turn, Simic Growth Chamber. His commander and the Growth Chamber trigger again. Zach gains a life, draws a card, and then returns Simic Growth Chamber to his hand. Zach plays Waterlogged Grove as his third land for the turn. Tatyova triggers, he gains a life, and he draws a card. Zach then discards a hand size and passes to Folger. Folger draws, holds up mana, and passes. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then moves to combat. Mike attacks Folger with Remorseful Cleric and Zach with Zealous Conscripts. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6, and then fails to find. Folger takes 2, and Zach takes 3. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Charles wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. He draws and then plays a Plains. Charles moves to combat and attacks Zach with his commander, Rebbec. In response, Zach casts Reality Shift, targeting Rebbec. Rebbec gets exiled, and Charles manifests the top card of his library. In his second main phase, Charles casts Recruiter of the Guard. It enters the battlefield, and then Charles fetches up Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle, into his hand. Charles then equips both his Sword of War and Peace and Sword of Feast and Famine to his Drannith Magistrate. He then passes to Zach. Zach draws, and then plays a Flooded Strand. Tatyova triggers, he gains 1 life and draws a card. He cracks Flooded Strand and fetches up a Mystic Sanctuary onto the battlefield untapped. Tatyova and Mystic Sanctuary both trigger. He orders the triggers to put Pongify onto the top of his library, and then draws the Pongify and gains 1 life. Zach plays a Mana Confluence, triggering Tatyova, gaining a life, and drawing a card. Zach then casts Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, and then untaps 3 lands. He passes to Folger. Folger draws, once again holds up mana, and passes. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt trigger and takes no damage. He draws and then moves directly to combat. Mike swings Remorseful Cleric at Folger and Zealous Conscripts at Zach. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6, and then fails to find again. Zach blocks with Azusa. Azusa dies, and Folger takes 2. In his second main phase, Mike casts Skyclave Apparition. Vial Smasher triggers, and Folger goes into high alert. Vial Smasher has a 1 in 3 chance of just taking Folger out. This starts a discussion at the table. Folger has 2 choices. He can take his chances with Vial Smasher, or he can overload a Cyclonic Rift. The entire table knows this is what he tutored for. If Folger does overload Cyclonic Rift, he can activate Deathrite Shaman, gaining 2 life, and live even if Vial Smasher hits him. However, he allows his opponents time to rebuild before he can capitalize on the tempo generated from Cyclonic Rift. What would you do in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. Folger, a very safe and conservative player, decides to cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Zach floats a green mana from his Chrome Mox. Rift resolves and bounces all of his opponent's non-land permanents to their hands. With Vial Smasher's trigger still in the stack, Folger activates his Arbor Elf and untaps his forest. He then activates Deathrite Shaman's 3rd ability, exiling Hushwing Gryff from Charles' graveyard, and then gains 2 life. Vial Smasher's trigger then resolves, and hits Zach for 3 damage. Skyclave Apparition enters the battlefield and then exiles Folger's Ghostly Pilferer. Mike recasts Mana Crypt. He then casts a Jeweled Lotus. Mike taps Battlefield Forge to cast Sanctum Prelate. In response, Zach casts Pongify, targeting Folger's Thalia. Pongify resolves, Thalia dies, and Folger creates a 3/3/8. Sanctum Prelate enters, and Mike chooses 1. Mike discards a hand size, and then passes to Charles. Charles draws, and then begins his rebuild by playing a Plains. He casts Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle. He casts a Mana Crypt, triggering Teshar. Teshar returns Stoneforge Mystic from his graveyard to the battlefield. Stoneforge Mystic triggers, and Charles fetches up a Lightning Greaves into his hand. Charles casts the Lightning Greaves. In response, Folger casts Fierce Guardianship. Fierce Guardianship resolves, and then counters Lightning Greaves. With his plans thwarted, Charles casts Cursed Totem. He follows it up by casting Archon of Emeria. Charles passes to Zach. At the end of Charles' turn, Zach activates his Blast Zone, putting 2 additional counters on it. Charles then discards a hand size. Zach draws and then recasts his commander, Tatyova, Benthic Druid. He moves to clean up, discards a hand size, and passes to Folger. Folger draws and then plays an island as his land for turn. He casts an Occam Adversary. Folger passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. He draws and then recasts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Mike moves to combat and attacks Charles with Skyclave Apparition. Winota triggers, he looks at the top 6, and then puts a Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Zach. The table erupts with excitement and despair. This is the perfect answer to Zach's Blast Zone, and then puts Mike and Charles into a commanding position. Charles blocks with Stoneforge Mystic, and Zach blocks with Tatyova. Stoneforge Mystic dies, and then Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Charles loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws and then casts Sword of War and Peace. Teshar triggers and targets Stoneforge Mystic in his graveyard. In response, Zach casts Negate, countering Sword of War and Peace. Teshar returns Stoneforge Mystic to the battlefield, and then Stoneforge Mystic triggers. Charles fetches up a Conqueror's Flail into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Folger with Archon of Emeria and Teshar. Folger doesn't block and takes 4 damage, going to 1. Charles then passes to Zach. Zach draws and then taps his Mana Confluence to cast Splendid Reclamation. Zach puts 9 lands from his graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. Tatyova triggers 9 times. Zach gains 9 life and draws 9 cards. Zach plays a Strip Mine as his land for turn. Tatyova triggers, he gains a life and draws a card. Zach ends his turn. At his end step, Mike flashes in a Village Bellringer. It enters the battlefield and then taps all of Mike's creatures. Zach then discards a hand size and the turn passes. Folger draws and then moves directly to combat. He attacks Zach with his Occam Adversary. Zach doesn't block and takes 2. Adversary triggers and Folger draws a card. In his second main phase, Folger recasts Vial Smasher the Fierce. He then passes. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. He draws and then moves to combat. Mike attacks Charles with Skyclave Apparition. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6, and then puts a Loyal Apprentice onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Folger. Folger blocks with Thrasios. In his second main phase, Mike casts Remorseful Cleric. He then passes to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles wins his mana crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. He draws and then casts Conqueror's Flail. Teshar triggers and Charles targets Stoneforge Mystic. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation, countering and exiling Conqueror's Flail. Stoneforge Mystic enters the battlefield, and Charles fetches up a Black Blade Reforged into his hand. Charles moves to combat, attacking Folger with Archon of Emeria. Archon deals 2 damage to Folger, killing him. Charles discards a hand size and passes to Zach. Zach draws and then casts Walk the Aeons. Mike responds by casting Deflecting Swat. Mike has Deflecting Swat change the target of Walk the Aeons to himself. Super bummed out, Zach then passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Mike draws and then moves to combat. Loyal Apprentice triggers and Mike creates a 1/1 Thopter. Mike attacks Zach with the Thopter token, Remorseful Cleric, and Winota. Winota triggers twice, Mike looks at the top 6, and then puts a Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Zach. Recruiter triggers, and Mike fetches up a Phyrexian Revoker into his hand. Mike looks at the top 6 again, and fails to find. Zach blocks the Recruiter with Tatyova and takes 7 damage. In his second main phase, Mike casts Combat Celebrant. Mike passes to himself. During his end step, Zach casts a Growth Spiral. Zach draws and does not put a land onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt trigger and doesn't take damage. Mike draws and then casts Zealous Conscripts. Conscripts enter the battlefield, and Mike gains control of Charles' Teshar. He moves to combat. Loyal Apprentice triggers, creating a 1/1 Thopter. Mike attacks Zach with his Combat Celebrant, exerting it to get an additional combat step. He swings with everything else at Charles. Winota triggers 5 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Glow Rider into play tapped and attacking Zach. The second trigger resolves, he looks at the top 6, and then puts an Imperial Recruiter onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Zach as well. Recruiter triggers, and Mike fetches up a Legion War Boss into his hand. He then looks at the top 6 3 more times and fails to find each time. Zach and Charles take it, Zach goes to 3, and Charles dies. Mike moves to his second combat step, and full swings at Zach, killing him and winning the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a crazy and extensive game. Congratulations to Mike on his clutch win. With all of the stacks at the table, Mike was able to pull it out with perfect timing on his Deflecting Swat and Combat Celebrant. Looks like Boros Beats gets there again at the CEDH table. The most valuable card goes to Winota, Joiner of Forces. Her ability to break parity by digging through your deck for more threats and hate bears while being unaffected by stacks pieces is an incredible engine. The key play that showcased her power was when Mike put Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield before Zach could respond with his Blast Zone and completely changed the course of the game. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. If you liked this video and wanted to help out, please give us a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already subscribed. Also, if you would like to see the raw gameplay of this video, be part of a great community, and have a chance to play with us, consider signing up to our Patreon. There are many tiers and many rewards available, and any support greatly helps us reach our goals. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Okay, I wanted to give a Patreon shout out to Delph Driz, Brandon Harper, Dustin Maillet, Josh Kovach, Baby Jeebus, Mox Rob, Trey Payne, Baskin, Rikeko, Zods, Noah Saldana, Wayan, Isaac Kaja, Spurahu, Road Grode Medflode, CZ, and Nick. Thanks a lot, you're the best.